So we're going to finish up respiration, but let's remind ourselves a little bit of what we talked about. We talked about the last time, the last thing we talked about was how oxygen is transported, and then we talked about what happens when you get to where you're going. And we talked about curve shifting with hemoglobin. And remember, we can't really change the shape of this curve, but we can move it. And so if we move it, what happens, we either decrease the affinity or we increase the affinity for oxygen. When we do that, it makes it either easier to load oxygen or it makes it easier to unload oxygen. Well, think about it. We load oxygen in the lungs, and so whatever happens, we would want it to be able to increase the affinity. We unload oxygen in the tissues. We're trying to get rid of it. We're trying to make it come off of hemoglobin, so we would want it to decrease the affinity. And that's exactly what we see. So when we look at curve shifting, remember the things that affect it are temperature. So here's temperature. And if we if we decrease the temperature, the curve shifts to the left. If we increase the temperature, the curve shifts to the right. And remember, it's dose dependent. That means is if I move it more, I get a bigger effect. If I move it less, I get a smaller effect. And so the colder it is, the further it moves to the left. The warmer it is, the further it moves to the right. And then they also talked about carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, and pH. And remember, we said all three of these are really, really closely interconnected. They're so interconnected you can't separate them. And so that's what you see here. So look, there's the carbon dioxide, there's the hydrogen ions, and there's the pH. And there was something I asked you to memorize. And what I asked you to memorize was that if you increase carbon dioxide, automatically you're going to increase hydrogen ions and you're going to decrease pH. And they're so connected that you cannot separate them. By the same token, if you decrease carbon dioxide, you're going to decrease hydrogen ions and you're going to increase pH. And again, they're so connected, you cannot separate them. And that's why there's only one graph for all three of these, because they're just really connected into basically one thing. And the reason I asked you to memorize it is, remember, you're going to use this forever if you stay in healthcare. But if I do increase carbon dioxide, increase hydrogen ions, or decrease pH, the curve shifts to the right. If I do decrease carbon dioxide, decrease hydrogen ions, or increase pH, the curve shifts to the left. And again, it's dose dependent. So the more carbon dioxide we have, the more it's going to shift. The less carbon dioxide, the less hydrogen ions we have, it's not going to shift as much. And then we have one other thing that we talked about that causes curve shifting. And remember, that's BPG. And BPG is a byproduct of anaerobic glycolysis. We only do anaerobic glycolysis when we don't have enough oxygen. And so if we don't have enough oxygen, we need to drop off more. And so BPG, as it goes up, what's going to happen is it's going to make the curve shift to the right, so we can drop off more oxygen. And so if we look at that curve, it looks like this. Whoops, this. So look, here's high BPG, and here's low BPG. So if this number goes up, we shift the curve to the right. If this number goes down, we shift the curve to the left. So that's where we were. That's where we stopped last time. And so we finished up talking about oxygen, but we haven't talked about carbon dioxide. Well, carbon dioxide also must be transported. It has to be transported. Remember, we're going to take it from our cells, And we're going to take it to the lungs, and there we're going to try to get rid of it. Remember, in the cells, we have a partial pressure carbon dioxide of 45. And in the lungs, we have a partial pressure carbon dioxide of 40. So look, we got rid of this much carbon dioxide. That happened in the lungs, but we have to get to the lungs. So let's talk about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is more soluble in water than oxygen is. It's more soluble. In fact, it's about 20 times more soluble. And so it's easier to put the carbon dioxide into the water of the blood. And so a whole lot more carbon dioxide will dissolve in the blood. And so it's about 7 to 10% that's going to be transported in the plasma. So it's just going to go into the blood, into the plasma. It's just going to separate in between the molecules. It's not going to change. It's not going to do anything. It's just dissolved. About 20 to 23% of the carbon dioxide is going to enter the red blood cell. And remember, there's tons of hemoglobin in here, and it's going to attach to the hemoglobin. But remember, it does not attach to the iron. It attaches to the amino acids. And so we call that carb-amino-hemoglobin. So if we add those two numbers together, we get about 30%. So what happens to the other 70%? Well, in order to talk about that, we have to remember this equation. Remember, when you put carbon dioxide in water, some of it will automatically chemically combine. That's different from dissolving. They chemically combine. And when they chemically combine, remember what's going to happen is we're going to make carbonic acid. And just like all acids, it's going to separate. And we're going to get a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. We already know this because this is what we talked about when we said that if you increase carbon dioxide, automatically you're going to increase hydrogen ions and you're going to decrease pH. We already know this. So it happens. Well, it happens much, much faster if there's an enzyme right here. If there's an enzyme, and the enzyme that produces this reaction is called carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase. Well, we don't have carbonic anhydrase hardly anywhere. But where we do have it is inside red blood cells. Red blood cells have a lot of carbonic anhydrase in them. And so carbonic anhydrase will catalyze this reaction. So this is going to happen much, much, much faster. So what happens to carbon dioxide is that it enters the red blood cell, and there's the carbonic anhydrase right there. So carbon dioxide is going to combine with the water that's in the red blood cell, and we're going to get carbonic acid. And that's going to dissociate into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. And then the bicarbonate ion, as it builds up in here, we're going to create a gradient. And so it's going to leave, and it's going to travel in the plasma. So this is the way 70% of the carbon dioxide is going to be transported. It's transported as a bicarbonate ion in the plasma. So the three ways carbon dioxide travels through the blood, 7 to 10% of it just dissolves, does not change, just dissolves. 20 to 23%, remember, is going to bind to the hemoglobin. Not to the iron, though, to the amino acids. And we're going to get carb-amino-hemoglobin. But most of it, remember, is going to go into the red blood cell. It's going to combine with water. We're going to make carbonic acid. It's going to dissociate. And what's going to happen is the bicarbonate ions are going to come out. And they're going to travel in the plasma. Any questions? Okay, well, let's look at it. So here is the blood cells. So remember, we're going to have external and internal respiration. Well, this is internal respiration right here. Remember, internal respiration is when we do gas exchange between blood and tissues. So remember, the tissues are making carbon dioxide. So it's going to be higher here than it is in the blood. Remember, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide here is 45. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in here in the blood is only 40. So look, the gradient is this way, 45 to 40. So what's going to happen is carbon dioxide is going to leave the cell and enter the blood. It enters the blood, we're going to transport it 3 different ways. About 7%, 7 to 10, is going to dissolve in the plasma. In other words, it's just going to float around in here. It won't change, it won't do anything, it just floats in here. About 20 to 23% is going to enter the red blood cell and combine with hemoglobin. And we're going to get this carb-aminohemoglobin. But most of it, 70%, is going to enter the red blood cell in the presence of this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. It's very, very rapidly going to turn into carbonic acid. It's going to combine with water. This is going to dissociate into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. And the bicarbonate ion is going to leave and go into plasma. And it's going to travel around just like that. And then when we get to the lungs, we're going to do external respiration. So remember, external respiration is gas exchange between blood and air. So if you think about it, we have to go down the gradient. Well, we picked up carbon dioxide, so the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is of 45. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the air of the alveolus is 40. So we're going to go this way. So what has to happen is all of that carbon dioxide is going to head out. Well, the dissolved carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma. It doesn't have any problem at all. It's just dissolved. It just goes out. The rest of it, remember, had something to do with the red blood cell. 20 to 23% was attached to hemoglobin. So what that's going to do is it's going to detach from the hemoglobin. And that carbon dioxide is going to go out. But the rest of it, remember, was traveling out in the plasma as a bicarbonate ion. It's not carbon dioxide, it's this bicarbonate ion. So what we're going to have to do is re-enter the blood cell. That bicarbonate is going to have to hook back up with the hydrogen to form carbonic acid. And then again, in the presence of this enzyme, very quickly, this will separate into carbon dioxide and water. And then the carbon dioxide can go out. Make sense? And then we're going to go back to the tissues again. So now tissues have a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of about 45. The blood has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of about 40. So carbon dioxide is going to go this way. So some of it's going to dissolve, 7 to 10%. Some of it's going to go in here and combine with hemoglobin and form carbaminohemoglobin, about 20 to 23%. Most of it is going to go into the red cell. In the presence of this enzyme, these two are going to combine. We're going to get carbonic acid. The bicarbonate and the hydrogen ion separate, and the bicarbonate is going to leave and travel in the plasma. And then when we get to the lungs, the opposite's going to happen. So partial pressure of carbon dioxide of the blood now is 45 because we picked it up. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide here in the air of the alveolus is 40. It's going to go this way. And so the dissolved carbon dioxide is just going to go out. The carbon dioxide that's attached to hemoglobin is going to detach and go out. But our bicarbonate is out here in the plasma. So before it can become carbon dioxide and leave, it has to go back into the red blood cell, hook back up with the hydrogen to form carbonic acid. And then in the presence of this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, that's going to break apart into carbon dioxide and water. And then the carbon dioxide will leave. Make sense? And then back to the tissues again, and then back to the lungs again, and then back to the tissues again, over and over and over. Any questions? Remember, it only works because gases move down their gradient. So if we look at the gradient for oxygen, remember it goes this way. But if we look at the gradient for carbon dioxide, it goes this way. Same thing over here, internal. If we look at the gradient for oxygen, it goes this way. But if we look at the gradient for carbon dioxide, it goes this way because it always goes from high to low. Any questions? Make sense? There's one other issue, and that is if we look at this, if we look at carbon dioxide, it has no charge on it. The charge on carbon dioxide is 0. Look, there's no pluses, there's no minuses on it. It's 0. So it combines with water. And this also has a charge of 0. Look, there's no pluses, no minuses on it. But when that hydrogen comes off, look, it has a positive charge. And that leaves bicarbonate with a negative charge. Remember, our bicarbonate, as it builds up, it's going to leave the red blood cell and enter the plasma. Well, look, it's going to take a negative charge with it. So if I keep taking negatives out of here, keep taking negatives out of here, what's going to happen is the inside of the red blood cell is going to become positive. I'm going to wind up with a potential, like on a nerve, on a muscle cell. Well, red blood cells don't need or work with a potential. So we're going to have to figure out a way to counteract this. So the way that is, for every bicarbonate that leaves, a chloride enters. And that's called the chloride shift. So the chloride shift happens at the tissues. It's when chloride enters the red blood cell, and it does so to prevent the red blood cell from developing a charge. But when we get to the lungs, remember our bicarbonate's going to go back in. So look, it has a negative charge on it. So I have a negative charge. That means everyone that comes in, negative, 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 negative. The inside of the red blood cell is going to become negative. The outside is going to be positive. We're going to have that potential again. And remember, we don't want that. So to keep that from happening, for every bicarbonate that goes in, that chloride comes back out. So we have what's called a reverse chloride shift. So the reverse chloride shift happens at the lungs. Chloride leaves, and it does so, again, to prevent the development of a charge. Does it make sense to everyone? So, chloride shift, again, happens at the tissues. And what it does is it prevents a charge from developing on the red blood cell. And then the reverse chloride shift happens at the lungs. And again, the reason it happens is to prevent the development of a charge on the red blood cell. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. So, that is transportation of carbon dioxide. And then that is external respiration. Remember, things move down their gradient. And internal respiration. And again, they're going to move down their gradient. And so we're going to get gas exchange. But something regulates respiration. When you breathe, you don't breathe constantly. We breathe and then we pause, and then we breathe and then we pause, and then we breathe and then we pause, and then we breathe and then we pause. Remember, it looks like the tide. We even have that name, the tidal volume. Remember, it's about 500 milliliters. So look, there's this time period in here when you're not breathing. And so we're going to control respiration. Now, if you exercise, we're going to start breathing faster. And we're also going to start breathing deeper. So something is regulating respiration, and it's regulating it based on need. Well, the brain is what's in charge of regulating respiration. So if you look at the brain, remember, it looks a little bit like this. And we have this part of the brain, which we call the brain stem. And that's what this is right here. This is the brain stem. The brain stem's got three parts. It's got the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. But the only two that are involved in respiration are the medulla and the pons. And so there are centers in here, there are neurons in here that regulate respiration. So let's look at these. There's 4 of them. There are 2 in the medulla, and there are 2 in the pons. In medulla, they're just called dorsal respiratory group, or the DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, or the VRG. So those are in the medulla. And then there are also 2 in the pons. And these are called the pneumotaxic center and the apneustic center. So 4 centers. So here's what they do. These two do normal respiration. In other words, they're the ones that make you breathe regularly. Most of us breathe about 12 to 15 times a minute. And remember, we move about 500 milliliters of air, and this is at rest. These are the ones that are responsible for that. But sometimes we need more air. And the one that makes us have a bigger breath, a deeper breath, is called the apneustic center, so that we get more air. Sometimes we don't need as much air. We just finished exercising. We don't need to keep breathing hard. That's the pneumotaxic center. And so the pneumotaxic center reduces how often we breathe and how deeply we breathe. So these two have to do with adjusting respiration, making it deeper, making it shallower, making it faster, making it slower. So let's look at these. So we have the DRG. Here's the DRG right here. And the DRG, again, has to do with normal breathing. So it receives input from a lot of different places and helps set normal rate and depth. Same thing's true for the VRG. So the VRG, again, it's going to help set normal breathing. Normal breathing is called eupnea. Eupnea means true or normal. And nea means breath or breathing. So most people breathe about 12 to 15 times a minute. And again, it receives a lot of information. It integrates all that information, and then it sends down the phrenic nerve. Remember that from AMP1? And we're going to make the inspiratory muscles work and make the expiratory muscles work and so on. And so we're going to get a normal breath. So here's that phrenic nerve. It comes down. We're going to tell the diaphragm to contract. And then we're going to stop telling it to contract and allow it to relax. And remember, breath looks like this. But breath can also look like this or like this. Remember, we can breathe in more than we normally do. And we can breathe out more than we normally do. Well, those are these other centers, the pneumotaxic and the apneustic, those centers. So let's look at what they do. What they do is they influence breathing. They modify breathing. And look, they send signals down to those other centers. They send signals down to the DRG and the VRG. And those signals tell the DRG and the VRG to either increase respiration or decrease respiration. Remember, the apneustic increases respiration. Why that plus sign is there. And there's the name apneustic. If you put A in front of a word, it means no. And pneustic, P-N-E-U, same root word from pneumonia comes from, is air. Look, no air. I don't have enough air. And if I don't have enough air, I should breathe more. And so it stimulates breathing. But look, this other one, this pneumotaxic center, pneu means air, and taxi means to move. In other words, air is moving, and it's actually moving too much. I'm either breathing too fast or too deep. There's too much air. And if I have too much air, I should slow down my breathing. I should slow down, and I should also not breathe as deeply. And so that's exactly what it does. It tells these other centers to slow down. Don't breathe as deeply. And so look, that's why there's this negative here, because it has a negative effect on breathing rate and depth. So we can breathe faster and deeper. That's this center. We can breathe slower and shallower. That's center. Does it make sense? So what does the DRG and the VRG do? Those set normal breathing patterns. And then what does the pneumotaxic center do? It makes breathing go down. It inhibits breathing. So you don't breathe as fast or as deep. And then what does the apneustic center do? It stimulates breathing so that you breathe deeper and you breathe faster. So DRG, VRG, and then here, this is that apneustic and pneumotaxic. Any questions? Well, the brain is regulating breathing, but in order for the brain to regulate it, the brain has to know what's going on. It has to have information or data. And so it's sitting there and it's collecting information from all over the place. And one type of information it collects is what is the level of carbon dioxide in your blood. So look, if carbon dioxide level in your blood is going up, that means you're not breathing fast enough. So if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises, what that means is that you need to breathe faster. And so it's going to stimulate breathing. We're going to breathe deeper. We're going to breathe faster to get rid of that carbon dioxide until the carbon dioxide goes back down to where it's supposed to go. And so there are monitors for carbon dioxide. They're called chemoreceptors. And those chemoreceptors are found in two places. They're found in the aorta and the carotid. Those are called peripheral chemoreceptors. So these are in those large blood vessels, the same place where the baroreceptors are, in the aorta and in the carotids. But we also have receptors in the brain itself. So they're called central chemoreceptors, and they're monitoring the cerebrospinal fluid. They're not monitoring blood like these are. They're monitoring the cerebrospinal fluid. And in either case, if carbon dioxide goes up, we're going to stimulate breathing. If carbon dioxide goes down, we're going to inhibit breathing. So the main regulator of breathing, is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. That's what's going to regulate how fast we breathe and how deeply we breathe. We also, though, monitor oxygen. And then we also have chemoreceptors for those. And again, they're found in the aorta and in the carotid. We don't have any in the brain. They're just in these blood vessels, in these arteries. But they send the information up to the brain. And what they do is, if your oxygen level drops, so you don't have enough oxygen, then you're going to speed up breathing. We're going to increase breathing rate and depth. But believe it or not, oxygen is not as important as carbon dioxide in determining how fast or how deeply you breathe. The most important factor regulating breathing is carbon dioxide. Here's where those receptors are, right here. They're in the aorta, and right here, they're in the carotids. And they're going to send that information up. And remember, it's going to go to the medulla. In the medulla, we have those two centers. Remember, they are the DRG and the VRG. And it's also going to go to the pons. And we have those two centers. Remember, we have the apneustic center and the pneumotaxic center. And so these four centers then together are going to regulate breathing. But how fast and how slow they regulate it depends on carbon dioxide levels and, to a lesser degree, oxygen levels. Does it make sense? So, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and so on. There's some other things that affect breathing. One thing is your conscious brain, your higher brain, the cortex. We get to choose how fast we're going to breathe. You can consciously control your breath. In other words, you can hold your breath if you want to. You can also breathe really fast if you want to. So that's another thing that affects it. It also is affected by receptors in muscles and joints, receptors in the lungs. And all those things also affect respiration. So when you start exercising, these receptors pick it up. And you'll actually start breathing faster before you get to the point of needing more air for your muscles. There are irritant receptors here. Remember, we don't want nasty stuff getting down in our lungs. If anything gets down in there, we do things like cough or sneeze. Well, those are just respirations. They're just weird respirations, but they're respirations. And then we get, hopefully, that stuff out. We also don't want to fill our lungs up too much, because remember, it's like a balloon. And if you fill a balloon up too much, it's going to pop. And so there are stretch receptors in the lung to keep you from overinflating. Because if you overinflate the lungs, you'll damage those little alveoli. So we don't want that to happen. Let's look at some things that can affect breathing. One of those things is asthma. So asthma is an inflammation of the airways. And what you get as a result of it is you get what are called bronchospasms. So remember we had blood vessels, and we said that if you constrict those, it's called vasoconstriction. Well, we have tubes in our lungs, the bronchi and the bronchioles. And if those bronchioles spasm, we get bronchoconstriction. And so bronchoconstriction is going to cause this to happen. It's going to close up until we only have just a little opening in the middle. And so if you look at it, it looks like this. So here's our bronchiole, and look, it's nice and wide and open, and air can flow through it very easily and quickly. But this one, look, we've had bronchoconstriction. And so the internal diameter is much smaller. And then also what happens with asthma is you get exudate forming. You get a thick mucus. So all of the cells in here, remember we talked about columnar cells, and we said columnar cells have these other cells next to them called goblet cells. Everybody remember that? And goblet cells make mucus. So they start making mucus like crazy. And the mucus fills up those bronchioles. So now there's even less space for air to get through. So instead of looking like this, it looks like this. Another thing that can affect respiration is a disease called tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium. It's a mycobacterium. There's a whole bunch of bad symptoms that go along with tuberculosis. But one of the things that happens is, here's that mycobacterium. When it gets in our lungs, we build a wall around it. A wall. And so when you look at that, you can see these walls that have been built. And they form these nodules in here. And if you take a person's lungs and look at them in autopsy, this is what they look like. But you can also see them on an X-ray, and that's what they look like. So these are those nodules that are formed around those bacteria. Well, sometimes the nodules rupture, and so you cough up or spit up blood. And that happens when you're pretty far along. Tuberculosis is a bad disease, and it seems almost like it consumes a person. And so an older name for tuberculosis is consumption. We can also have things like emphysema and bronchitis. All of those things affect respirations. And then, of course, we have lung cancer. Lung cancer is a very hard cancer to treat. So once you get it, you don't have a very long life ahead of you. The good thing, if there is a good thing about lung cancer, is that almost all cases of lung cancer are associated with smoking. Look, it's about 90%. Well, when you do get lung cancer, this is what happens. The lung changes its anatomy. So here's a smoker's lung. And if you look at a smoker's lung, it becomes black. It fills up with all of the products of the cigarette. It becomes stiff, so they don't open and close the way normal lungs do. And sometimes cells in here will change. And what they do is they sort of forget the rules. The rules are that when one cell touches another cell, it's supposed to stop growing. But these forget it. They just keep dividing and keep growing. And so we wind up with malignant tumors. And you can see these on an X-ray. And here's what those malignant tumors look like that right there. And they grow. Well, there's several different types of lung cancer, but the three most common types are these. I'm not going to ask you to remember them, but you might be interested. But there's squamous cell, there's small cell, and then there's adeno. And here's what cancerous lungs look like. So you can see these tumors in here. And basically it takes over the lung. And so lungs after a while don't even really look like lungs anymore. And now you can see that huge tumor there. Any questions? So that is the end of respiration. Any questions? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.